The courtroom is filled with murmurs as people find their seats. The smell of fresh coffee lingers in the air, and the faint sound of rustling papers echoes against the tall oak walls. Judge Henderson sits at his bench, his gavel resting in front of him. Like a silent warning, the room quiets as the bailiff calls the case, and everyone turns their attention toward the defendant. Mariah Lewis steps forward, a tall woman dressed in a simple black dress that speaks of quiet confidence. She moves with an air of calmness as she walks past the rows of spectators, her dark skin glowing under the courtroom lights. She takes her place at the defendant's table with a graceful ease and sits her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her face an unreadable mask, her dark eyes scanning the room as the whispers continue around her. No one expects her here. No one expects a woman like her to be accused of something as trivial as theft. The judge glances down at his notes, not looking up to acknowledge her presence, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the gavel as he reads through the case file. He already knows what he expects the case to be: a simple routine charge of shoplifting. He has seen hundreds of them before in his years as a judge, but something about this woman seems to draw his attention in a way he doesn't quite understand. She isn't the typical defendant in his courtroom. She doesn't fidget or shuffle nervously. She doesn't avoid eye contact. Instead, she looks straight ahead, her posture perfect, as if the weight of the situation doesn't even face her. He wonders who she is, but dismisses the thought quickly and motions for the defense lawyer to begin. The lawyer stumbles to his feet, his hands shaking as he grabs the papers in front of him. The sound of rustling paper fills the room. He clears his throat, but his voice still cracks as he begins to speak. He starts talking about the evidence: a misunderstanding at a high-end grocery store where Mariah had accidentally placed an item in her purse without realizing it, but his words seem weak and unconvincing. The judge doesn't even look at him. His gaze is still fixed on Mariah, whose face remains impassive as the lawyer continues to speak. Her eyes never stray from his. Her silence, almost mocking the poor defense. She sits as if the whole situation is beneath her, and for a moment Judge Henderson can't help but feel a flicker of doubt deep in his chest. But the moment passes quickly. The judge clears his throat and addresses the court, his voice booming across the room. He focuses on Mariah now, not the lawyer, not the case, but her, the way she carries herself with such calm authority, her composure unsettling to him. He asks her directly if she is guilty of the crime. He asks her to admit to it so they can move on, but her response isn't what he expects. She doesn't break down and confess. She doesn't seem afraid. Instead, she looks him in the eye and calmly explains her side of the story with a quiet but unwavering voice. She tells him she never intended to steal anything and that the situation was simply a mistake. She recounts the events with a kind of detail that makes the judge hesitate for just a second. He watches her closely. Every word she says seems measured, every gesture controlled, but there is something about her that makes him question his first assumption. Could it really be this simple, or is there more to this case than meets the eye? Mariah continues to speak, her words flowing with a smooth rhythm. She describes the confusion that happened in the store as she hurriedly searched for a gift for her sick mother, how the store clerk had mistakenly placed the item in her purse as she juggled a few bags and her phone at the same time. She explains how she didn't notice until she was halfway home when she checked her purse and saw the item there still unopened. She hadn't taken anything on purpose, and she offers to show the receipt and the items she had purchased, but the judge cuts her off. His eyes narrow as if he's heard enough, his voice sharp and commanding. He tells her that the story sounds like an excuse to get out of trouble, and he's heard it all before, people trying to wiggle out of responsibility with fabricated tales. The room goes silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Mariah doesn't flinch, her gaze steady as she meets the judge's eyes, not backing down for even a second. The defense lawyer stammers and tries to interject, but the judge waves him off, dismissing him as insignificant in this moment, his focus entirely on Mariah, her calmness unnerving him even more. He turns back to her and demands she tell the court why she didn't just return the item immediately. Why didn't she report the mistake? Why did she wait until now to come forward? He insists that people who truly make mistakes are quick to rectify them, and her actions, or lack thereof, seem to suggest guilt instead of honesty. Mariah's expression doesn't change. She remains poised and collected. As she responds with a soft but firm voice, she explains that she didn't want to make a scene or cause trouble at the store. She says she didn't realize what had happened until she was already on her way home, and that she was preoccupied with caring for her mother. She repeats that she never intended to steal, and that the whole situation was a misunderstanding. The judge listens, but he isn't convinced. He already has an image of her in his mind, a person who is too confident to be innocent, someone who must be hiding something beneath that calm exterior. He doesn't believe her, and it becomes evident as his tone grows harsher. He accuses her of trying to manipulate the court, trying to use her calm demeanor as a cover for her actions. The room seems to shrink around them, the words between the judge and the defendant growing more charged with every exchange. The defense lawyer looks helpless as he fumbles for words, but nothing he says seems to shift the judge's opinion. Henderson continues to press Mariah on the details of her story, each question becoming more pointed as he attempts to expose what he believes is a lie. Mariah responds with the same clarity each time, her voice never wavering, but there's a sense of mounting frustration in the air. As the judge grows more and more impatient, he's convinced now that she's guilty, her calmness only fueling his suspicion that she is hiding something from him. Finally, after a tense pause, Judge Henderson leans back in his chair, looking down at the case file. With a dismissive glance, he sighs and shakes his head as if the answer is already clear to him, his voice cold, as he announces that the evidence speaks for itself, and that the court has seen enough to make a decision. He declares that Mariah will be fined a significant amount for the theft, and that she will have to pay the penalty immediately. The room stirs in quiet disbelief, some shocked at how quickly the judge has passed judgment, while others shift uncomfortably in their seats. The decision seems harsh, but Judge Henderson seems resolute in his ruling and doesn't offer any room for further discussion. As the gavel comes down, the tension in the courtroom remains palpable. Mariah remains unmoved, her face still an unreadable mask as she silently prepares to comply with the judgment. The courtroom falls into a heavy silence after the gavel comes down, the air thick with uncertainty and disbelief. Mariah doesn't immediately react. She doesn't flinch or make any movement that could suggest she's upset. Instead, she calmly reaches into her bag, her fingers brushing over the soft leather of her purse as the judge watches her from his bench, his gaze piercing her every move. The spectators shift uneasily in their seats, many of them exchanging glances, some with sympathy, others with a sense of discomfort, as the weight of the sentence settles in. The fine that Judge Henderson has imposed is no small sum. It's a punishment that seems disproportionate to the nature of the crime, but the judge seems unmoved by the growing tension in the room. His decision is final, and he feels certain of it. Mariah takes a deep breath before pulling out a small leather wallet from her bag. The courtroom watches with rapt attention as she carefully opens it, the crisp sound of the wallet's flap echoing slightly in the stillness. She flips through it as if looking for something important, her fingers moving with precision and purpose. The judge's brow furrows as he continues to observe her, his arms folded across his chest. The room waits with bated breath, wondering what she'll do next, but no one expects the sight that follows. From within the wallet, she pulls out a small, official-looking badge and places it flat on the table between her and the judge, her hand steady, her expression unchanged. The silence is immediate and total. The murmurs that have been circulating through the crowd before quickly die down as everyone in the room processes what they've just seen. The badge is unmistakable. The blue and silver design clearly identifies her as a federal prosecutor. The realization hits like a wave washing over the courtroom. Suddenly, everyone is aware of the gravity of the moment and the mistake that has just been made. The judge's eyes widen as he stares at the badge, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the words to process the unexpected revelation. The courtroom buzzes with whispers, some people leaning in to get a closer look, while others sit back in their chairs, stunned by the turn of events. Henderson's mind races as he stares at the badge, his thoughts a whirl of confusion and embarrassment. He hadn't even considered the possibility that this woman was someone of such stature. He had assumed she was just another defendant in a minor theft case. But now he realizes he has just treated a federal prosecutor with the same harshness he would afford to any ordinary person accused of a crime. The room is now filled with an uncomfortable energy, the atmosphere shifting from one of judgment to one of uncertainty as people start to realize the full weight of the situation. Judge Henderson's face turns pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam as he scrambles for a way to salvage the situation. But it's clear to everyone now that his actions have crossed a line. The whispers grow louder as Mariah sits quietly across from him, her posture still composed, her eyes never leaving his face. She hasn't said a word since revealing her badge, but her presence alone is enough to make the judge question everything he thought he knew about this case. He looks around at the faces of the people in the courtroom, trying to gauge their reactions, but they all seem to be waiting for him to make a move. It's as if the room is holding its collective breath, waiting for him to acknowledge the mistake he has just made. The weight of the moment presses down on him harder than any case he's ever presided over. Judge Henderson shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest, his eyes darting back and forth between Mariah and the badge on the table, his mind racing to make sense of what just happened. How had he not known? How had he misjudged her so completely? The room is silent except for the low hum of whispers that swell through the crowd like the murmur of a rising tide. Everyone is waiting for the judge to speak, but he doesn't immediately. He's too caught up in his own thoughts, his reputation now hanging by a thread. He clears his throat, but the sound feels small and hollow compared to the weight of the situation. He wonders how much the people in the room already know, how much they've pieced together without him even saying a word. Mariah sits across from him, her face still unreadable. She's a picture of calmness in a storm of his making. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the judge speaks, his voice shaky but louder than before. He asks her what her role is as a federal prosecutor. He knows the answer before she gives it, but the words seem to escape him. He needs to hear her say it out loud. He needs to confirm his worst fear, that he has made a grave mistake. Mariah doesn't flinch, her eyes still locked on his as she answers, her voice calm and measured. She tells him that she's been working as a prosecutor for several years, specializing in criminal law. She explains that she handles cases involving everything from drug trafficking to organized crime, but she's never had to face such an embarrassing situation before. Not like this. Henderson listens, but his mind is already spinning. He can't fathom how he could have been so blind to her identity, how his assumptions about her had clouded his judgment. He tries to cover his unease with a forced cough, but it only seems to make things worse. The room watches in tense silence, every eye on the judge as he struggles to regain control of the situation. He glances down at the case file on his desk, as if it might offer him some sort of answer, but it's clear he's only buying time. He mumbles something about needing to review the evidence again, but no one seems to believe him. Mariah doesn't speak again. She simply watches him with that same calm demeanor, the look on her face giving nothing away. Henderson can feel the weight of her gaze on him, like a spotlight, making his earlier certainty crumble with every passing second. He begins to feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he's never experienced before in his years on the bench, and he knows that his credibility is now in question. He looks around the room at the faces of the people who have been witnesses to this farce. Some of them seem uncomfortable, others seem almost amused at the irony of it all. He's a judge, a man who has spent his career delivering swift justice, and now he finds himself caught in a moment of profound embarrassment. He can feel the eyes of the spectators burning into him, but it's not just their judgment that stings, it's his own realization that he has failed to live up to the principles he swore to uphold as a judge. Mariah Lewis, a woman who should have been treated with respect and fairness, has been made to sit through an ordeal she didn't deserve, and now he has no way of undoing it. The whispers grow louder now. People in the back of the room are starting to murmur to each other, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief, others exchanging knowing glances. The air is thick with the tension of a mistake that can't be easily fixed. Henderson feels the pressure mounting. He knows he has to do something to make it right, but his mind is blank. All he can think about is the way he's mishandled this case from the very beginning, the way he's let his assumptions and biases shape his actions, and now he has to find a way to salvage what little dignity he has left. Judge Henderson shifts in his seat again, his palms sweaty against the smooth wood of the bench, his mind racing as he struggles to regain his composure. The silence in the room is oppressive. Every second that passes feels like an eternity as the eyes of the courtroom remain fixed on him, waiting for him to make his next move. He can feel the weight of his error pressing down on him more with each passing moment. He glances once more at Mariah, but her face remains unchanged, her expression calm. But there's something about the way she's looking at him that makes him uneasy. It's not anger or frustration, not even disappointment. It's simply a quiet acknowledgement that something has gone terribly wrong and it's his fault. He clears his throat again, but it sounds hollow this time, the sound betraying the unease that has settled deep within him. He looks down at his case file once more, but the papers in front of him blur into meaningless shapes. He can't focus on the text anymore. His thoughts are a tangled mess of self-recrimination and confusion. He knows that he's made a mistake that's clear to everyone in the room, but what he doesn't know is how to fix it, how to undo the damage he's done to this woman's dignity, and how to restore the balance of justice that he's sworn to uphold. Mariah doesn't speak again. She simply sits there, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture impeccable, her calmness only serving to make him feel more like a fool. The crowd seems to hold its breath as if waiting for some kind of dramatic response, but Mariah doesn't give them that. She remains silent, her composure unshaken. And it's in that silence that the true weight of the moment becomes clear. The judge realizes that the more he falters, the more he reveals his weakness, that his failure to handle this case with the fairness and respect it deserved has already been noted by every person in the room, and there's no way to undo it. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, Judge Henderson looks up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. but steady as he speaks. He apologizes for his actions, his tone far softer than it had been when he first addressed her. It's a simple apology, but it carries with it the weight of everything that's gone wrong in this courtroom. He acknowledges his mistake. He admits that he was wrong to make assumptions based on her appearance, her demeanor, and his own preconceived notions. He tells her that he understands now the gravity of his error, and that he is deeply sorry for the way he has treated her. He pauses as if waiting for her response, but she doesn't say anything right away. She simply looks at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. The judge's heart races as he waits for her to speak. He's bracing himself for a sharp retort, or perhaps even an outburst, something to match the gravity of his mistake. But instead, Mariah simply nods, once her eyes still locked on his. She doesn't say a word, but the look in her eyes tells him everything he needs to know. She accepts the apology, but there's no sign of forgiveness in her gaze, not yet. At least the weight of the apology lingers in the air. But it's clear that this moment has changed something fundamental in the judge. And in the room itself, the atmosphere has shifted once more, and the burden of his error seems almost unbearable. The murmurs in the courtroom grow louder again, now that the tension has broken slightly, but the sense of discomfort remains. No one knows exactly what to say or how to react to the apology. It feels like a moment of reckoning, not just for the judge, but for everyone who has witnessed this case unfold. Judge Henderson sits back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Mariah, though he can no longer bring himself to meet her gaze fully. He feels small under the weight of her calm presence, her unwavering silence like a mirror reflecting his own failure back at him. The apology hangs in the air, heavy, but incomplete. He waits for her response, hoping she will say something, anything to break the tension, but she doesn't. She just nods her head once and looks away from him, her eyes briefly drifting to the badge on the table, the same badge that now seems like an indictment of his own incompetence and bias. He wonders if she will say anything at all, or if this will be the end of it, but the room remains painfully quiet, and still, as if everyone is holding their breath, waiting for the next move to come from either her or him. The defense lawyer finally speaks after what feels like a long and awkward pause, his voice hesitant and unsure as he attempts to steer the case back on track. But the words sound hollow in the space between them. It's clear that the case is no longer about the charge of theft, not about the fine that the judge had imposed. It's now about something far more personal and unsettling. It's about the assumptions and judgments that people carry with them every day, the ones that shape how they view the world and the people in it. The lawyer's words are drowned out by the growing realization that this is no ordinary case, no simple courtroom drama. This is a moment of reckoning, a moment where the judge's character is being questioned as much as the defendant's. Mariah doesn't interrupt the lawyer. She simply sits there, her hands still folded neatly in front of her, her eyes never leaving the judge for long. But her silence speaks volumes. It's not a silence of submission. It's not a silence of fear or even anger. It's the silence of someone who knows the truth and who has already decided that nothing more needs to be said. She's no longer interested in defending herself, not in the way the judge or anyone else might expect her to. She's already done that with the revelation of her identity, with the calm dignity she's shown in the face of his aggression. Her silence is her response, and it's more powerful than any words could be. The judge clears his throat again, his nerves fraying as the seconds drag on. He can feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but it's not just the spectators or the defense lawyer. It's the weight of his own self-doubt bearing down on him now. He had spent years in the courtroom believing that he was above reproach, believing that his experience and authority could guide him through any case, no matter the circumstances. But now he sees how fragile that belief was, how easily it can be shattered by a single moment of careless judgment. He begins to realize that he has just witnessed something far more important than the simple unraveling of a case. He has witnessed the failure of his own worldview, his own assumptions about who belongs in a courtroom and who does not. He turns to the clerk and speaks in a low voice, asking for the case file to be reviewed once more. But even as the words leave his mouth, he knows it's too late. The case isn't about evidence anymore. It isn't about the facts of the theft or the fine. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about the very principles of fairness and justice that he is supposed to uphold as a judge. The realization strikes him hard, and he finds himself suddenly aware of just how much he has taken for granted about the nature of power in this courtroom. Mariah doesn't look at him as he speaks to the clerk. She's focused on the badge in front of her now, her fingers lightly grazing the edges of it as if contemplating something far deeper than the case at hand. She has already won this battle, and yet the silence between them remains a reminder of the unspoken truths that have come to light today, truths that cannot easily be ignored or erased from the room. The The judge watches as Maria's fingers trace the edge of her badge, a gesture so simple and so deliberate that it feels almost like an act of defiance, but there's no hostility in her movements, no anger. She isn't making a statement, she isn't waiting for an apology or any dramatic show of remorse. She's simply contemplating the situation in the same calm way she's done throughout this entire ordeal. The judge feels the weight of her silence more deeply now than ever before, and the silence in the room grows thicker with every passing second. He knows that he has to do something to repair the damage, but he can't figure out where to begin, how to fix what he has broken so carelessly with his arrogance, his assumptions about her and her place in this courtroom. He looks at the clerk who stands nearby ready to assist, but Henderson doesn't know what to say or ask. The case file feels like a distant concern. Now the fine he imposed earlier now seems trivial compared to the deeper questions that linger in the air, questions about justice, about equality, and the way people judge others based on surface-level perceptions. He feels his position unraveling in his mind. He's a judge, someone entrusted with upholding the law and maintaining order, but in this moment he feels as though he's become a part of the very system he's supposed to police, a part of the very machine that perpetuates these biases and injustices. Maria remains still, her eyes now focused on the table, not looking up at him or anyone else. She's not waiting for any kind of dramatic apology from him. She's not waiting for him to admit he was wrong. She's already moved past that. She's already made her judgment, and it's one of quiet finality. She has nothing left to prove. Her silence has spoken volumes in this room, and it's the kind of silence that carries more weight than 1,000 words could ever convey. She isn't here to teach him a lesson or to demand an apology. She is simply here to see that justice is done, and that the truth is heard, and now that she's made her point, she will leave this place with the dignity that was denied her at the start. The judge looks at her again, his heart sinking with each passing moment as he realizes the full weight of his mistake. He thinks about his own career, his years of experience, and the many cases he's overseen without a second thought about how he's treated the people before him. How many times has he assumed too much about people based on their appearance or their demeanor? How many times has he let his own biases seep into his judgments without even realizing it? He wonders if there are other cases, if there are other moments where he has treated people unfairly based on assumptions he hadn't even acknowledged to himself. He wonders if this is just the beginning of a much larger reckoning, one that he cannot escape from, and he feels the deep sting of that realization. He feels the loss of control and the understanding that he cannot undo what he has done, but he must move forward with the knowledge that things must change. After what feels like an eternity, Henderson stands up from his chair, his movements stiff and hesitant. He looks down at Mariah for the first time since she revealed her identity, his eyes softening slightly as he prepares to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, as he begins to ask for forgiveness. But before he can say another word, Mariah finally looks up at him, her gaze steady and unwavering, her eyes meeting his without any sign of malice or anger, only quiet understanding. She doesn't speak, but the look she gives him says it all. There's nothing left to be said here. She has already judged him, and her judgment is not one of condemnation, but of quiet recognition that the system has failed her, but more importantly, the system has failed itself. She doesn't need his forgiveness, she doesn't need anything from him, she simply stands as a witness to his failure, and now all he can do is reflect on it, and face whatever consequences come next. The courtroom is silent again, the weight of the moment now fully realized by everyone in the room. The silence in the room stretches long and heavy like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The atmosphere is thick with unspoken thoughts and realizations. No one moves, no one dares to breathe too loudly. The judge stands at the bench, looking down at Mariah, still feeling the crushing weight of his own failure. His mind races as he searches for something to say, something to undo the damage he's caused. But the words don't come. He feels like a man adrift, lost in a sea of his own mistakes. He wants to explain himself, he wants to apologize in a way that makes sense, but nothing seems adequate enough for what he's done. Nothing can undo the way he has misjudged her from the start. Maria remains seated, her posture as immaculate as ever, her gaze unwavering. She isn't looking for a show of remorse, she isn't asking for him to fall at her feet. She's simply waiting for the next step, waiting for him to recognize the consequences of his actions. She has already done her part, and now it is his turn to face the truth. The room is still waiting for something to happen, but no one knows what that something is. All eyes are on Henderson, but he feels smaller than he's ever felt in his life. His position of authority seems distant now, like something he can never reclaim. The weight of Maria's silence presses down on him harder than any words could ever do, and in that silence he knows she has already made her judgment about him, and there is nothing left to say. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, he clears his throat and slowly approaches the bench, his steps heavy and slow. He looks down at the case file, But it's not the file that matters anymore, it's everything that has led to this moment, the assumptions he made, the rush to judgment, the way he allowed his own biases to shape his decisions. He glances over at Mariah one more time, but she doesn't look at him this time. Her eyes are focused on the table, her hands resting gently in front of her. And in that moment, he realizes just how much he has failed her, and how much he has failed everyone who has ever been caught in the crossfire of a system that values power over fairness. He speaks at last, his voice shaking as he tells her that the fine he imposed earlier is null and void, that it will be erased from the record entirely. The words sound like a hollow attempt to make things right, but even as he says them, he knows they don't truly fix the situation. Nothing will ever fix the way he has mishandled this case. He knows that no amount of procedural corrections can erase the harm he's caused, the damage to her dignity and to his own integrity as a judge is too deep for any simple reversal of a fine to make a difference. Mariah doesn't respond, she doesn't nod or offer any sign of acknowledgement. She remains still, her silence now a quiet, a powerful testimony to everything that has gone wrong here. The judge feels the weight of her gaze again. But it's different now. It's not a judgment on the fine or the case, it's a judgment on him, on his own failure to recognize her humanity and his own flaws as a person tasked with overseeing justice. The truth of it hits him like a slap to the face. And in that moment, he knows he will never be the same again. The room seems to hold its breath as he finishes speaking. There's an awkward pause as the audience tries to make sense of what has just transpired. The defense lawyer shifts uncomfortably on his feet, not sure what to say or how to proceed. Everyone in the room is unsure of what comes next, but no one dares to speak. The silence feels like a void between them all, a space too wide and too deep to be bridged with mere words. At last, after what feels like an eternity, Henderson takes a step back and looks around the room, his voice now quieter as he speaks to the clerk, asking for the record to be amended and the fine to be officially removed. Mariah still says nothing. She doesn't move, she simply remains there in her seat, still as stone, and just as unyielding. Her silence has spoken louder than anything he could have said in response. And as the judge makes the necessary adjustments to the case, he knows that nothing will ever undo the truth that has been laid bare today, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The judge's hands tremble as he reaches for the paperwork, his fingers fumbling as he attempts to amend the record. But it's clear now that no matter what he does, the moment has already passed. The judgment has already been made, not by the court, not by the law, but by Mariah's silent strength, her refusal to be intimidated by the weight of his authority or the arrogance he had shown earlier. She hadn't asked for anything, not for a reversal of the fine, not for a dramatic apology. She had simply exposed the flaw in his thinking and left him to face the consequences of his own actions. The room remains still, but there's a sense of something shifting beneath the surface, like the first tremors before an earthquake. It's a change in the air, the kind of change that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. The clerk moves toward the judge with the updated documents, but Henderson barely notices the papers in his hands, his focus still on Mariah. Her stillness, her unspoken power, are the only things he can think about now. He had thought he was in control. He had thought that his experience and authority would be enough to guide him through anything, but now he realizes how fragile that control was, how easily it had slipped through his fingers. The weight of his own ego had clouded his judgment, and it had taken a woman of grace and intelligence to make him see it. And now as he stands there, he knows that he can never return to the man he was before. Mariah's silence hangs over the room like a heavy fog. No one speaks, not even the defense lawyer, who has been practically silent since the judge's apology earlier. Everyone is waiting for something, but they don't know what it is, waiting for the final word or the final gesture that will make this moment feel complete. But there is no word, no gesture that can make things right. The truth is already out there, and nothing can undo the damage that has been done. No words can erase the look of quiet resolve on Mariah's face as she sits there, her eyes now distant, her mind already far away from this place. She isn't here for closure or for redemption, she is simply here to be heard, and now that she has been heard, she has nothing more to say. The judge looks around the courtroom again at the people who have witnessed this moment. He sees the unease on their faces, the discomfort, as they sense that something important has just happened, something that is too difficult to put into words. He wonders if they feel the same way he does, if they too are aware of the deep flaws in the system that have been exposed here today. He looks at the defense lawyer, who seems to be waiting for instructions, but the judge doesn't have any. He can't bring himself to continue with business as usual, as if nothing has changed. He can't simply return to the formalities of the court and pretend that everything is fine when it's not. The weight of the moment feels too heavy for that. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the judge turns his attention back to Mariah, her face still calm, her posture still perfect, but there's something about her now that wasn't there before. It's not anger, it's not even disappointment, it's just a quiet, resolute understanding that she doesn't need anything from him anymore, not a favor, not an apology, not even justice. As the room holds its collective breath, he realizes that Mariah has already walked away from this moment. Even though she's physically present, she has already left this courtroom behind in her heart and mind. She has already moved past him, and he's left to stand in the ruins of his own failure. Henderson finally speaks, his voice soft but clear, as he gives a final directive to the clerk to ensure that the record is corrected and that the fine is nullified. The crowd stirs slightly as the reality of the moment begins to settle, and no one knows how to react. No one knows how to move forward from this point. Everything has changed, but nothing can be said to make it right. The judge feels the weight of his words as they leave his mouth and land in the air with an eerie finality. There is no satisfaction in them, no sense of relief, only the uncomfortable truth that they are far too little and far too late. Mariah doesn't flinch, doesn't nod, or even acknowledge the change in the proceedings. She simply remains where she is, poised and still, like she has been all along. The silence in the courtroom is almost unbearable now, the weight of her presence overshadowing everything else, as the judge stands there wondering if this moment will be his reckoning or simply another in a long list of failures that he will eventually try to forget, but can never escape. The reality is impossible to ignore, and no matter how many formalities he checks off now, it can never take back the disrespect he showed her or the damage to his own integrity. As the judge steps away from the bench, he feels exposed, like he's been stripped of any pretense of authority. His hands are cold against the papers he holds, but there is no comfort in the routine of paperwork. Now, no structure that can shield him from the truth that he's failed at his most basic duty to judge impartially and fairly. He has violated the very principles that are supposed to guide him as a judge, and in that violation, he's opened a crack in the system, a crack that can never be fully sealed over. No matter how hard he tries to repair it, his gaze shifts back to Mariah, but she hasn't moved. Her gaze is fixed ahead, her expression unreadable, and yet there's something in the way she holds herself that makes him realize how futile his previous actions have been. Her quiet dignity has already claimed this moment, and in her silence, she has taught him more than any punishment or reprimand ever could. The court clerk shuffles behind the judge, handing him the amended paperwork with the new instructions to erase the fine. The formality of the action feels absurd now, as if it's a mere form of window dressing in a room full of truth, too painful to ignore. The judge barely registers the clerk's presence, his mind still fixated on Mariah as he reviews the document, but the reality of what he's done and what he's learned remains a heavy presence in the room. It's not just a case anymore, not just a minor theft charge or a fine that could be easily waved away. It's a reflection of the deeper flaws in the judicial system, a system that judges people based on appearances and assumptions, a system that often fails to recognize the humanity of those who pass through it. And now that realization is staring him in the face. The spectators in the room seem almost afraid to move, as if any sudden action might disturb the fragile atmosphere that has settled in the space. They are all witnesses to something far more profound than they had expected to see today. But none of them know what to say or how to respond to it. What do you say when someone in a position of power is faced with their own shortcomings, when the person who is supposed to uphold justice has failed to do so in such a glaring way? The energy in the room feels thick, as if everyone is waiting for something to break or for someone to give an explanation. But no one moves, no one dares to speak aloud for fear of breaking the delicate balance of this moment. Mariah finally shifts in her seat, her posture still elegant, but there's a subtle change in the air now. It's as if she's ready to leave this place behind, to walk out of this courtroom and leave the moment where it belongs, in the past, behind her. And yet the weight of it remains in the air. As the judge watches her, he wonders if she will say anything before she leaves. Will she address him? Will she offer a final thought on the proceedings? But there's no sign of it. Her silence remains steadfast as she rises from her seat and gathers her belongings slowly and with purpose, her movements graceful but resolute. She isn't here to make a spectacle of this moment. She's here to claim her dignity back, to leave this place with the quiet strength that she's shown throughout the entire ordeal. As she begins to walk toward the door, the room seems to exhale collectively, but no one moves. They all remain in their seats, watching her leave, as if witnessing the exit of a storm that has already passed through, leaving them all in its wake. The judge stands still, his gaze following her retreating figure, knowing that there is nothing left to say, nothing he can do to undo what has happened. And as Mariah walks out of the courtroom, he realizes that the true lesson has been learned not through words, but through the quiet act of dignity and strength that she has shown throughout every moment of this case. As the door closes softly behind Mariah, the courtroom remains frozen in time. The judge stands there, his posture stiff, his thoughts scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror. No one moves for a long moment, as if they are all waiting for something to happen, something that might make sense of what has just transpired. But the truth is, there is no sense to be made. There is only the uncomfortable reality that nothing will ever be the same again. The judge looks down at the papers in his hands, the amendments that have been made to the record. But they seem insignificant in comparison to the enormity of what has just occurred. They can't erase the feeling of being exposed for what he truly is, a man flawed like anyone else, who has allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment. He feels as though the weight of everyone's eyes is still on him, even though the room is empty and quiet. The walls seem to close in on him, as if pressing him into the uncomfortable realization that he cannot undo the damage of his own actions. The defense lawyer stands slowly, his movements hesitant as he gathers his belongings and prepares to leave. He has been almost entirely silent since the apology, and now seems unsure of how to handle the lingering tension in the room. He casts a glance at the judge, who has yet to move or speak, and then looks around the courtroom as if unsure of what the next step should be. But there is no next step. Not really. The case has ended, but the echoes of it will continue to linger in the judge's mind, long after the formalities are finished, long after the spectators leave the courthouse and go on with their lives. The moment of reckoning that Mariah Lewis has created will remain with him forever, and he knows that it will be something he will carry with him as long as he holds the gavel. The clerk hesitates at the back of the courtroom, unsure of whether to interrupt or simply let the judge be. He stands there for a moment, watching Henderson, who is still staring blankly at the empty space where Mariah had been sitting only moments before. The clerk shuffles his feet nervously, but the judge doesn't acknowledge him. He simply remains lost in his thoughts, the weight of his own failure hanging over him like a shadow that refuses to lift. Finally, the defense lawyer speaks, his voice low and respectful, as he turns to the judge and thanks him for the decision to remove the fine. He doesn't speak with any particular enthusiasm. There's no celebration in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of the changes that have been made. But the judge barely hears him. His thoughts are still consumed by Mariah's final moments in the courtroom, her silence, her strength, her unwavering dignity in the face of everything he had put her through. He realizes now that she never needed his apology or his approval. She had already claimed the power in that room without saying a word, and he had been the one who had failed to recognize it. The lawyer waits for the judge to respond, but Henderson remains still, staring at the place where Mariah had been seated, lost in his own introspection. The lawyer hesitates for a moment longer, and then begins to gather his things to leave. But he too is affected by the atmosphere in the room. He feels the change in the air, and it makes him unsure of his place here, of his role in this strange moment where justice had been served, not by the system, but by a quiet woman who had known exactly how to wield her own power. The judge finally blinks, as if emerging from a fog, his gaze shifting slowly back to the lawyer. But even as he tries to focus on the man in front of him, he can't shake the image of Mariah's calm face from his mind, her quiet strength echoing in his ears. And for the first time in his career, Henderson wonders if he is truly worthy of the role he holds, or if he has been simply playing a part in a system that he has never fully understood. The judge clears his throat, breaking the silence, but his voice comes out strained and unsure, his mind still wrapped around Mariah and everything she had represented in that courtroom. He looks at the defense lawyer, whose polite presence only seems to highlight how far removed the judge feels from any semblance of control. Now Henderson nods slightly in acknowledgement, but his words feel inadequate, like a hollow shell of what he wants to express. He tells the lawyer to ensure the record is updated and the fine officially removed. But even as he says it, he knows those words mean nothing. Not really. They don't change the fact that Mariah has already won something far more important than a legal decision. She has shown him the depth of his own failings, and there's no piece of paper that can correct that. The clerk stands at the back of the room, waiting quietly for instructions, but it feels like the space between them has grown wider. As the judge struggles to find his footing, once more he doesn't know what to say or how to explain what has just happened. All he knows is that the world looks different to him now, and it's as if his entire career, his years on the bench, have been leading up to this one painful lesson in humility. It's not just about the case anymore, or even the fine. It's about the fundamental flaw in the system that has allowed him to become blind to the truth. It's about the way power works in this room, and how quickly it can be misused when those who hold it fail to see beyond their own assumptions, their own biases. The lawyer speaks again, this time his tone more measured, as if sensing the judge's turmoil. He offers a few words of courtesy, but it's clear that neither of them knows how to proceed. The conversation is almost like an afterthought. The formalities are an empty exercise in a room that has already been transformed by the events that just unfolded. The lawyer pauses, waiting for the judge to respond, but Henderson doesn't know what to say. There are no words that feel right to fill the silence between them, no gesture that can bring him back to the man he thought he was before. Outside the courtroom, the world continues on as it always does. People file in and out of the courthouse, unaware of what has just transpired within those walls. But to the judge it feels like everything has changed and there's no going back. He wonders if anyone will ever truly understand what happened here today, if anyone will ever grasp the depth of the shift that has just occurred in him. He feels the weight of his failure, not just in his actions toward Mariah, but in the way he has failed every single person who has ever walked into his courtroom and left feeling unseen, unheard, or misunderstood. The enormity of that failure is too much to bear in one moment, and yet it's inescapable, like a shadow that has followed him for years and now finally caught up with him. The judge exhales slowly, his gaze shifting back to the defense lawyer, who waits for him to finish his thoughts, but Henderson can't seem to focus on anything but the silence that now fills the room. He stands there, his thoughts scattered, trying to make sense of it all. But it's clear now that there's no easy explanation, no clear resolution to this moment. All he can do is face it and try to learn from it, though he knows that doing so will take time and will not come easily. The sense of failure lingers like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest, and as the lawyer quietly gathers his things to leave, the judge remains standing in the middle of the courtroom, alone with his thoughts, surrounded by the emptiness that feels far more real than any ruling or fine he has ever imposed. The door closes softly behind the lawyer, and the judge is left in complete silence once again, but this time it is different. The silence is no longer a void waiting to be filled. It is the quiet of a man who knows he has been irrevocably changed, and must now figure out how to live with that knowledge, how to carry it forward into every decision he makes from this moment on. As the last echo of footsteps fades down the hallway, the judge stands alone in the quiet of the courtroom. The air feels different now, heavier, somehow as though the walls are closing in on him, but in a way that isn't suffocating. It's as if the space itself is challenging him to confront everything he's ever known, everything he's ever believed about justice, authority, and power. The weight of his own thoughts presses against him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in his career, he feels completely exposed, as if all the walls he's built around himself have crumbled and left him standing naked before the truth. He turns slowly toward the bench, the seat of his authority, but now it seems hollow, almost comical to him. It is just a chair now, just an object that once gave him power, but in reality it was never the seat that commanded respect. It was the trust of the people, the belief that he would be fair and impartial, that he would see through the veneer of appearances and truly understand the people who came before him. But how many times had he failed to do that? How many times had he let his biases shape his decisions without ever stopping to question them? How many people had he hurt in the name of upholding the law, when in fact he had only been perpetuating a system that was built on inequality and assumptions? He sits down at the bench, but it feels wrong somehow, his hands gripping the smooth wood as if trying to steady himself in the midst of a storm. But the storm is inside him. It's a whirlwind of regret and self-reflection that has no easy answer, no safe harbor to anchor in. He thinks of Mariah and the way she stood there so calm, so certain of herself. Even when faced with his ignorance and arrogance, she hadn't needed to say a word to make her point. She had simply allowed the truth to speak for her, and now it's that same truth that is haunting him, whispering in his ear that he has failed, that he will continue to fail, until he learns to see people for who they truly are and not for the labels and assumptions he's so quick to attach to them. Outside the courtroom, the courthouse continues its rhythm of business as usual. The hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, the steady churn of justice that goes on even when one man's world has been turned upside down. Henderson feels like he's standing still in the midst of it all, like time has paused just for him to face this moment, and he knows deep down that he can't go back to the way things were. There is no pretending that everything is fine, no returning to the judge he was before. Mariah's quiet yet profound lesson. He has seen the cracks in the system now, and those cracks are wide enough to let in the light of truth, a light that will not be easily ignored. The judge takes a deep breath and stands slowly, his gaze lingering for one last moment on the empty chair where Mariah had sat. He wonders if she knew how much she had changed him, or if she had even cared. Perhaps all she wanted was for her voice to be heard, but in doing so she had ignited something within him, a spark of recognition that would not be extinguished. He steps away from the bench and moves toward the door. But before he exits, he pauses for a moment, as if waiting for something, waiting for the sound of Mariah's voice, or the reminder of the lesson she has taught him, but all he hears is the soft hum of the courthouse as it continues on without him. He exits the courtroom and steps into the hallway, not sure where the path will lead him, but certain that it will never be the same path he was on before, because in that room where power and justice collided, he had learned the most important lesson of all, that true authority comes not from the position one holds, but from the humility to acknowledge one's own failures and strive to do better.